Good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the BBKA for the invitation to speak at this BBKA Spring Convention and to the CB Dennis Trust for kindly sponsoring this session this evening. I see that the programme for this year's convention is a very varied and interesting one. I'm very fortunate that I can make my presentation in a personal capacity and make observations which hopefully won't offend. My challenge was to prepare something which would put us all into a reflective frame of mind without us falling asleep at this time in the day. Perhaps as we listen to all the speakers on the topics they will present, we can let our minds also consider the context of the presentations and their contribution to the future of the honeybee and the beekeeper who interacts with them. I must also appreciate the fact that some of you are watching for a pure interest perspective, whilst others may be wondering if Beekeepers is for them. And of course, many of you are already practicing beekeepers. For me, this is my 40th year of continuously keeping bees in the East Riding of Yorkshire in the northern part of England. Every year has brought challenges in my beekeeping experiences, with no 2 years the same in our ever-changing world. My talk will introduce a selection of topics which I think are important to us and will impact our honeybees in the short, medium and long terms. So I've called my short presentation Tipping Points and Perceptions, and hence the two motifs representing tipping points and perceptions on this slide. Even before the COVID pandemic began, it was clear that humankind is accelerating fast into an environmental car crash of epic proportions. The increasing dysfunction of human societies and their place in the functioning and course of the processes which contribute to planet Earth have introduced into our daily conversations the term tipping point. Closely associated with the term tipping point is the concept of perception. The human brain and the societies it has created, including today's, are increasingly influenced and driven by virtual reality, artificial intelligence and social media. In the case of climate change, attitudes to its very existence, let alone the time it will take before it impacts us, still vary widely, and a significant proportion of the human race appears to continue to deny it. Through social media, we are in communication with each other much more frequently and are susceptible to influences. But in my view, we are increasingly out of touch with the fundamental processes which drive the planet on which we live. Contact with the real world and our precarious place in it becomes less and less. This is regardless of the programmes by David Aston and many others, as well as the reams of printed word on the topic of climate change. Yet, if anything, as we watch these programmes in our homes, we are presented with images and narratives which have become largely formulaic. They still do not open our eyes to the real state of our world and its biodiversity and our place in the Earth's ecosystems. Not that my attitudes to social media are all negative, because we have seen much good arising from the ability to communicate so widely and so quickly. But before we set out on our journey, I think it is useful to define what we mean by tipping point and perception. I looked in various reference sources for definitions and the results are interesting. A tipping point was defined as a point during an activity or process when an important decision has to be made or when a situation changes completely. Or it was also defined as a critical moment in a complex situation in which a small influence or development produces a sudden large or irreversible change. The last definition, the point at which a slow reversible change becomes irreversible, often with dramatic consequences. I hope we get the idea. I then turned to perception. And perception was defined as a belief held by a person or by many people based on how they see the world around them. Or it was the sensory experience of the world. Or a perception in humans, the process whereby sensory stimulation is translated into organized experience. So now that we've defined our terms, we can step out. Our politicians and their advisors use sticks and carrots to influence and direct human behaviour with the promise that the more compliant we are, the quicker we can get back to normal. It is a fallacy, an illusion, even a delusion. There is no normal. The world has moved on and the situations have changed. Phenomena such as the SARS-CoV-19 global pandemic have had a profound effect, both positive and negative, not just on humans, but also to all cohabitants of planet Earth. The human species will have to contend with new circumstances and the increasing likelihood of new pandemics in our own species and in many of the animals and plants on which we depend for our food. Avian flu and swine vesicular disease to name but two. Even during the midst of the Second World War, planners in this country were looking to build a post-war society which will be able to improve the lot of the individual, including health, social, economic and security. And I believe we should be doing something similar today. And according to the government, we are. We are planning for the future, post-COVID-19. So, we should think global and act local. To safeguard our honeybees in the future, I believe that as beekeepers, we should be actively engaged in the deliberations which are now taking place for life after SARS-CoV-19 in the short term, and perhaps even more importantly, adapting to climate change for the medium and longer terms. The National Trust recently published on their website an online map showing current and predicted effects of climate change in England and Northern Ireland, and it is well worth spending the time exploring it. The map can be found on their website and is titled National Trust Climate Hazards. But spice the mix with the impacts of Brexit, and it is clear as beekeepers we must become more engaged and not be passive bystanders and let others make the decisions and we merely bend with the wind. So let us consider the motivation of beekeepers. These images capture some aspects of beekeeping, and each picture has the potential to tell a story. Beekeepers come from all parts of society, and there's no prejudice in who becomes a beekeeper. Sadly, a few people cannot become practical beekeepers, perhaps for medical or other reasons. However, all is not lost, because there are many ways in which their curiosity can be sated. So why did we, or might we, become beekeepers? What do we see in the future, short, medium and long term? In other words, what are our perceptions? Perhaps it's for pleasure and social gatherings, and beekeepers across Britain are familiar with their summer Saturday afternoon apiary meeting with tea and cake and the chance to chat about bees. Honey shows, agriculture and craft shows, farmers markets, fetes, fairs and galas are all shop windows for the craft and the products of the hive. So perhaps it's for income. Or perhaps it's because you're interested in pollination and the contribution the honeybee makes to the fruit, vegetables and other components of our diet and the biodiversity in our environment. Or perhaps it's all three, and no doubt there are more reasons. There may be all sorts of motivations in terms of pleasure, seeking an understanding of and working with the bees, the social side of beekeeping, beekeeping associations, studying, teaching and mentoring, and talking to others about honeybees. If income is the motivation, then it involves the production and sale of honey and other products of the hive. And this is dependent on having healthy, productive colonies with access to good variety and quantities of forage, both nectar and pollen. But what changes to forage will take place in the future because of habitat destruction, changes in agricultural practices, reduction in floral variety and quantity, and the subsequent impact on honey yields, as well as the supply of pollen, which is the honeybee's source of protein. The impact of changing agricultural practices may have positive and negative outcomes, and we wait to see our changing regime of funding support for farmers for environmental works for the public good being implemented. In the 1980s, beekeepers reported an increasing proportion of their honey yields came from oilseed rape, and their beekeeping practices evolved to accommodate the properties of this crop. In recent years, sowing of oilseed rape has reduced significantly, largely because of the ravages of the cabbage stem flea beetle and the rapeseed winter stem weevil. Agronomic changes have been made, including the use of integrated pest control management techniques where possible. And there's been much discussion on the use of insecticides such as synthetic pyrethroids and neonicotinoids. Pesticide resistance has developed. Products have been banned, but still the oilseed rape acreage continues to fall. Published government figures show that in 2019 the area sown with oilseed rape fell by 9.2%, and I believe it continues to fall. Do we as beekeepers or our representative organisations actively keep tabs on what the farmers and the agronomists are trying to do to keep oilseed rape as a viable crop in the UK? If this decline continues, what other significant nectar and pollen yielding crops will take its place? So, have we reached a tipping point in terms of the viability of this crop in UK agriculture? And many perceive the use of insecticides as unacceptable. So where does beekeeping go from here? Perhaps this may mean that field beans are the only other significant arable crop. Then there's pollination. This is an absolutely fascinating subject, not because of the honeybees, but also all the other pollination mechanisms that have developed in the plant world. Pollination is of vital importance to ecosystems. Today, the word ecosystem is frequently heard, but sadly, the word and its use have become much corrupted and debased. I'll offer a couple of definitions of the word ecosystem. The first, it's a community of living organisms in conjunction with the non-living components of their environment, interacting as a system. And these biotic and abiotic components are linked together through nutrient cycles and energy flows. An alternative definition is that an ecosystem or a biome describes a single environment and every living biotic organism and non-living abiotic factor that is contained within it or characterizes it. It's common practice to refer to many facets of ecological systems in terms of ecosystem services, and it's necessary for us to consider this further. Ecosystem services are the many and varied benefits to humans gifted by the natural environment and from healthy ecosystems. And ecosystem services are also described as the many and varied benefits to humans provided by the natural environment and from healthy ecosystems. And these ecosystems functioning in a healthy relationship offer such things like natural pollination of crops, clean air, extreme weather mitigation, and human mental and physical well-being. In other words, does this mean for exploitation and consumption by humans to meet their needs, irrespective of the consequences? What does this ultimately mean for the world's ecosystems? Such attitudes will make it difficult to reform and adjust man's behaviour, despite an utter dependence on the natural environment. Nevertheless, pollination is considered an ecosystem service. As beekeepers, unless we supply honeybees on a fee-paying basis to a grower, then our honeybees are providing a free pollination service to society and for biodiversity. And many beekeepers subsidise their honeybees and beekeeping activities quite considerably. And I believe as beekeepers we do not emphasise and press this point anywhere near enough. No matter how much the merits of other pollinators are promoted, there are often more specialist pollinators for particular plant species. Yes, other pollinators do make significant contributions to the ecosystem service of pollination and may on an individual basis be more efficient as a pollinator than a honeybee. However, there are few other pollinators which are present in sufficient numbers at all times and able to work most types of flowers, even as secondary robbers, and with the greatest geographical spread than the honeybee. So, what is our perception and who and what we as beekeepers are? Are we practitioners of a craft steeped in traditions, a rustic pursuit with elements of it being slightly wacky, Or is it an activity of vital importance to biodiversity on the one hand and the needs of the societies of the human species on the other, and should be recognised as such? How do we perceive our honeybees? And perhaps as importantly, how does society view them? The question as to whether honeybees are domesticated, semi-domesticated, native, wild or feral has been written about many times. Today, managed honeybees are legally considered as livestock along with cows, sheep, pigs and chickens. And honeybees and their keepers are subject to various pieces of legislation, especially in terms of pest and disease control, as well as the regulation of the hive products. In many ways, this attitude towards honeybees probably has its roots in the changes that took place in Victorian agriculture. For example, it accompanied social changes. There was increase in mechanisation and industrialisation on the land and the growth of the industrial society. The reduction in the number of workers on the land. People seeking to broaden sources of income for them and their families. The rise of the middle classes. The growth of beekeeping associations. The development of agricultural shows. Honeybee product competitions, judging as in flower and vegetable shows. An obsession with standardisation and national standards, for example the British Standards Institution, and in educating beekeepers. All reinforce the perception and ultimately the practice that honeybees should be dealt with in the same way as pigs, sheep, cattle and poultry. In other words, through inspection, control, breeding and rules. Today, we refer to managed honeybee colonies and colonies that have escaped from the beekeeper control as feral colonies, such as this colony in the side of a wooden barn. Such colonies, together with any other honeybee colonies, whether they are truly wild or feral, we are taught to view them with suspicion and attempt to control them. And this often means to destroy them so as to prevent them becoming reservoirs of pests and diseases. Today, I think the consensus of opinion is that managed honeybees can best be perceived as semi-domesticated. Concern is now being expressed on how small the genetic pool is from which most queens and honeybee colonies originate. A contributory factor may be the importation of honeybees from outside the UK, or their production in the UK from a relatively small number of sources, each having a few genetic lines. And some impacts of the effects of inbreeding can be seen in this slide. Attempts by beekeepers to select and perpetuate consistently selected strains over many years have been largely unsuccessful, and as Professor Tom Seeley has remarked, have done very little to change the basic genetics of the honeybee. So rather than seeking to reduce the number of wild or feral colonies, perhaps we should be actively encouraging their continued existence. Within the populations of such colonies, there is greater chance of genetic variation and the potential for natural selection to select adaptive traits which have the opportunity to be taken up in the managed honeybee colonies through mixed source mating of drones with virgin queens in drone congregations. These topics concern perception, a potential point in our attitude to the status of honeybees and the need to stimulate genetic diversity. My next topic concerns our preparedness for exotic threats to our honeybees. Current experiences with COVID should make us question our effectiveness at recognising exotic threats, not only to humans, but to many other plants, trees, livestock on which we depend, and also their potential threat to our flora and fauna. The threat risk from the invasion of exotic pests and diseases, and the potential for these pests and diseases to change their hosts outside their natural range, is ever increasing. Considering honeybees in particular, it's one thing to look for a beetle in a lorry load of boxed and packaged fruit, or a container lorry packed with plants in transit, but quite another to keep out a non-symptomatic level of viral infection in a honeybee. Many pests and diseases which are arriving in Europe and then via Europe or directly into the British Isles arise through global trade. The two examples on this slide reflect the threats and risks associated with pests and disease being helped by international trade. It must be concerning to us that as we pivot away from Europe for our future prosperity, that this increasing globalization will challenge even more our effectiveness in the detection of pests and diseases and in achieving biosecurity. Do we actually have the resources, infrastructure and capability to identify and manage such threats to our honeybees in the British Isles? The importation of queens and colonies of bees from Europe must increase the risk of exotic threats to the honeybee being introduced into the British Isles. Perhaps we have reached a tipping point in that we should consider sourcing all our queens and live bees from UK bred stocks which have been comprehensively screened. Likewise, we could cease to import any honeybee material, including eggs and sperm, unless they are properly screened. Beekeepers should be encouraged to rear their own queens, and I know many beekeeping associations help to facilitate this. I would now like to turn to a very practical beekeeping matter, and that concerns varroa. The subject is our perception of the varroa status of our colonies and how we estimate the size of the varroa population. I wonder how many of us actually systematically determine the varroa status of our colonies through the beekeeping season. If we do not use inserts and conduct mite drop studies, we'll probably take off the hive roof and the cover board before taking out some frames and looking at the bees. And comment on whether we see any varroa riding on the back of the bee during the mite's phoretic phase. Or we might observe the presence or absence of bees with deformed wings through damage caused by deformed wing virus. But does the presence or absence of mites when viewed from above really mean much? Perhaps it does, in that the presence of mites in the phoretic phase implies there are more elsewhere. In 2019, Ramsey et al. Reported that mites fed off the fat body tissue. They also found that the majority of the feeding mites, that is to say the ones, and there may be several at any one time, doing the damage, are on the underside of the bee's abdomen and difficult to see, let alone derive some idea of the population size unless you sample the bees, and then, for example, by using the Beltsville test of killing the bees and counting the mites washed from the bee bodies to estimate the varroa population. And this graphic shows their results and the frequency of distribution of the mites found from a sample of infested worker bees. The colour intensity showing the percentage occurrence. Leaving behind exotic threats, both past and present, I would like now to touch upon nutrition and honeybee health. This is a huge subject and there's much literature about it. Nutrition considers both quantity and quality, and whether the honeybee colonies and individual bees which make up the colonies have access to the nutrients and other substances they need. Not only to survive, but also to reproduce and to be healthy. In our beekeeping, we need to consider the varying needs of the colony throughout the year and understand the factors which will influence and even dictate whether or not a colony survives, let alone thrives. We must perceive of nutrition evolving much more than just feeding the colony sugar syrup in the autumn in readiness for winter, or in an emergency when the colonies run short in a period of dearth in the summer. We need to be able to recognize and understand the differences between hunger, starvation and malnutrition, their causes and how best to prevent such occurrences. Irresponsible harvesting of honey and attempting to remedy the situation by feeding sugar syrup, even if the colony survives, merely stores up problems for the future. Increasingly, I think that if the beekeeper routinely has to feed sugar syrup to maintain carbohydrate availability in readiness for winter, or during times when there is little or no forage available, this suggests that the location where the bees are being kept is unsuitable, or the colonies are too big, or there are too many colonies attempting to subsist on the forage which is available. We need to really understand the quantities of pollen and nectar a colony requires over the year. We should determine whether or not the area around the apiary, remember the potential area of foraging could be several square miles, and will provide sufficient quantity, quality and availability of forage throughout the beekeeping season. We need to work hard on achieving a perception of the amount of nutritional resources that are available to it. We should be spending as much time and effort looking at the local forage potential as we do when we studiously examine our honeybee colonies for the presence of pests and diseases. Wild honeybee colony densities in natural areas of woodland reported in the literature vary, but can be as little as 1 per square kilometre, which prompts us to ask whether our stocking densities are too high. Do we need to rethink our perceptions as to how many colonies can be supported by the local forage around our apiaries? We should determine whether the resource is also being shared by other beekeepers' colonies. I now turn to the subject of pesticides, which can be a highly emotive subject and one in which our views and opinions are often confused and sometimes inconsistent. And synthetic pesticides are substances designed to control and manage pests, and by definition they exert a controlling influence on the target organism. They include herbicides, insecticides, nematicides, molluscicides, pesticides, avicides, rodenticides, bactericides, insect repellents, animal repellents, antimicrobial substances and fungicides. The UK HSE definition of pesticides includes plant protection products and biocides, and we also of course have a category of chemicals called substances of concern. Pesticides are xenobiotics, that is to say chemically synthesized compounds, but are just one of a range of other materials which challenge the honeybee when they are exposed to them. Xenobiotics also include pharmaceutical drugs, drug metabolites, environmental compounds or pollutants, and industrial and domestic pollutants not found in nature. I think we will agree we all use products which help us to achieve standards of cleanliness, freedom from disease, cures of disease, and slow down or prevent the loss of materials to biological and physical chemical degradation. The use of chemicals, especially pharmaceutical, pesticides and biocides in modern society is regulated and deals with the health, safety and environmental aspects in their intended use. A key part of the regulatory process has been the application of the concepts of hazard and risk, with the hazard being defined as the intrinsic properties of the substance or the material, and the risk the potential of being exposed to the defined hazard. The concept and application of the terms hazard and risk have been well understood and applied in regulatory legislation in the UK for many years. The regulation of pesticides and biocides, drugs, pharmaceutical products and so on was developed early in the UK. But the regulatory process is always in a state of continual change and evolves in the light of experience. A key aspect of the regulation of pesticide and biocide legislation has been assessment of the effects of the substance when used as intended on non-target organisms, and the honeybee often fall into this category. As the assessment process becomes more searching, the identification of sublethal effects has taken place, starting a renewed process of developing and writing guidance to regulators on how to assess these effects, and to industry on how to provide data which can be assessed. So there has been a change in the level, the individual honeybee and the colony basis of the perception of the need to investigate such aspects. There is a need to further evolve the assessment of risk that the candidate products or the chemical substances might pose to the honeybee in its area of intended use. Earlier I referred to the reduction in area of the amount of oilseed rape being grown in the UK, and much of this being due to the inability to control a pest due to there being restrictions placed on the use of an effective class of substances, namely neonicotinoids. But have we reached a tipping point in terms of the use of pesticides in some or all of their current end-use applications? Do we have a perception of the balance of the pros and the cons? The UK government has launched a review seeking attitudes towards the sustainable use of pesticides in response to the draft revised National Action Plan on the sustainable use of pesticides. And it will be interesting to see the responses sent in and the government's response. The final version of the revised National Action Plan will replace the 2013 version of the document. When oilseed rape first became very widely grown, crop protection products included the insecticide Trouserphos, though many colony losses and damaged colonies were reported. This was in part due to the product being sprayed into the open rape flowers. But beekeepers, mainly through the activities of their national associations, engage robustly with the pesticide producers, the farming industry and the government agencies. And through dialogue they achieve changes in the ways in which the products could be used, reducing the risk of exposure of the honeybee to the pesticide. Honeybee colony losses through the application of this and similar products fell sharply. And today the formal reporting process of the Wildlife Incident Reporting Scheme records few colony losses due to pesticide application. Through dialogue, experience has shown that you earn respect for your position and concerns. Actions can be taken to resolve many of the perceived problems and issues. Such was the case in recent years when the BBKA engaged with various parties and pushed for the development and introduction of the Bee Connected scheme. This scheme connected beekeepers with farmers, informing them about the crop protection activities nearby, and by keeping beekeepers notified when a neighbouring farmer is going to apply insecticides to their crops up to 5 kilometres from their apiary. Silent mentalities help no one. So perhaps in the case of pesticides, we may have reached a tipping point which could mean substantial reductions in their use and areas of application, which in the case of oilseed rape could mean a loss of a substantial proportion of nectar and pollen resource available to the honeybee in many parts of the country as this acreage is grown. Over the course of the pandemic, large quantities of bactericides, viricides and other hand and surface cleaning products containing biocides have been washed down the drain, and not a word appears to have been said about the potential environmental consequences. Perhaps our perceptions of pesticides and biocides, as well as pharmaceutical products and veterinary medicines, need a little more reflection. Or do we remain somewhat inconsistent in our stances? My last topic is that of sustainable development. It combines both the aspects of my talk's themes, perception and tipping points. But what do we mean by perception? Who is sustaining what and for whom? Again, I suspect at the end of the day, our perception is doing things that are mainly for the benefit of humankind. Sustainable development is defined as the growing, organising principle of meeting human development goals while simultaneously sustaining the ability of natural systems to provide the natural resources and ecosystem services on which the economy and society depend. In other words, sustainable development by this definition is primarily focused on meeting human demand, not the environment. In February 2021, the UK government published a review which had been sponsored by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2016 and conducted by Professor Sapatha Dasgupta. The report is titled The Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review. The full report is about 600 pages long, but it's well worth reading. Pollinators receive a mention, but honeybees specifically don't. As far as I know, beekeepers weren't invited to make a contribution to the report. Why not, I ask myself. One of the headline messages of the Dasgupta Review, and which is possibly a potentially key tipping point for our society and the economy, is that the solution starts with understanding and accepting a simple truth. Our economies are embedded within nature and not external to it. The perception that honeybees play a vital role in biodiversity and the consequences of inadequate pollination are well known to us as beekeepers, but do we make effective representation of this fact to society, policymakers and decision takers? We're all making policies and taking decisions in our daily lives which will impact on the way our behaviour will affect the environment. To do this more effectively, we need to be better informed and empowered. Honeybees continue to get mixed up with these strange representations of bees. I think they're supposed to be bumblebees, which further encourages an incorrect perception and understanding of the honeybee. Yes, have some fun and enjoyment, but the message has to be loud and clear. Pollination is a deadly serious issue, and honeybees are crucial pollinators. They need to be accurately represented. In closing my address, it's clear that dialogue, consultation, compromise, and understanding the needs and the requirements of all stakeholders, both human and non-human, on our planet are skills we need to use more than ever in the future. In this way, we can acknowledge man's long relationship with this insect and safeguard the future of our honeybees and sustain beekeeping as an honourable activity. To do this, beekeepers need to be planning for the future as much as any other facet of human society. Well, I hope I've triggered a few thoughts as we start the new beekeeping season. Thank you for listening, and please do enjoy the convention. Good night.